somewhere along the Mississippi River, in a parish whose name has been intentionally scrubbed from all official records, there once stood a plantation where 17 men died under circumstances so disturbing that Louisiana authorities ordered every document connected to it burned in 1847. Yet what makes this case truly haunting isn't the number of deaths. It's a single repeated detail found in every surviving witness account. Each man had been discovered clutching a small scrap of indigo-dyed cloth, their eyes frozen wide open, and on their lips the same whispered name. The woman they spoke of appeared in plantation ledgers as the most highly coveted property in the entire Delta region. Yet not a single bill of sale for her has ever been recovered. For more than a century and a half, this story has been deliberately erased from Louisiana's historical record, surviving only in fragments of diary entries, coded letters exchanged between plantation owners, and testimonies that remain sealed by court order until 1952. What happened on that unnamed plantation reveals something far more terrifying than any ghost tale: the cold, calculated patience of a woman who understood exactly how desire could be turned into a weapon, and how men's obsessions could be used to orchestrate their own downfall. Before we continue with the story that later became known in hushed whispers as the Indigo Terror, I need you to do something. If stories where historical truth is darker and far stranger than fiction fascinate you, then hit that subscribe button right now. And tell me in the comments what state or city you're watching from, because this story reaches into a kind of darkness that once stretched across the entire South. I want to know where my audience is tuning in from as we uncover the forgotten horrors. Now, let me take you back to a time when human beings were bought and sold like livestock, and show you how one woman turned that very system into an instrument of methodical revenge. The Mississippi Delta in 1839 was a place of contradictions. Magnificent mansion homes with towering white columns rose out of swampland, their paint gleaming against a backdrop of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. Even the air seemed heavy with wealth, thick with the scent of sugarcane and cotton, crops that generated fortunes measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. This was the richest agricultural region in America, and everyone knew that its wealth rested entirely on the bent backs of enslaved people who worked from dawn until darkness swallowed the fields. St. Landry Parish, though it was known by another name then, was especially prosperous. It held 47 major plantations, each functioning as its own small kingdom, with absolute authority concentrated in the hands of its owner. These men, mostly French Creole families who had held their land since before the Louisiana Purchase, competed viciously with one another. They competed in crop yields, in the grandeur of their homes, in the bloodlines of their horses, and, most disturbingly, in the appearance and quality of their human property. Within this world of brutal hierarchy and grotesque social rituals existed a shadow market that polite society never acknowledged in daylight, but eagerly indulged in after dark. Certain enslaved women, those considered exceptionally beautiful by the twisted standards of that era, became objects of intense competition among wealthy planters. They were traded, gifted, argued over, and sometimes even fought for in ways plantation ledgers carefully avoided documenting. The practice was so widespread it even developed its own coded language in letters exchanged between planters. Into this world, in the spring of 1839, arrived a woman whose appearance, based on the descriptions that survived, seems almost intentionally designed to torment the men who laid eyes on her. She was brought to St. Landry Parish by a cotton broker named Lysander Thielt, a man known for sourcing rare and highly valuable property for Louisiana's wealthiest planters. The woman, identified in his personal journal only as the Gautier acquisition, had been purchased from a declining estate in Charleston, South Carolina for an astonishing $3,000, more than triple the price of a skilled male field hand. What made her worth so much? Thielt's journal, discovered in an attic in Baton Rouge in 1923, offers unsettling clues. He described her as having striking classical features, skin the color of polished copper, an unusual height and posture, and eyes with such piercing intelligence that even hardened overseers felt uneasy in her presence. But it was another detail he recorded that should have been a warning. She possesses a stillness that feels unnatural, he wrote, as though she is always watching, always calculating. I admit she unsettles me, though I cannot explain why. The woman was 26 years old, remarkably old for such a purchase. Most enslaved women in the secretive trade were teenagers or in their early 20s. Her age alone suggested an unusual past, a depth of experience most men either failed to notice or deliberately ignored in their eagerness to claim her. Thiel planned to sell her at a private auction to the highest bidder among 5 of the parish's wealthiest planters. But before the sale could take place, something happened that triggered a chain of events no one could have foreseen. The woman escaped, or rather, she appeared to escape. On the night before the auction, she vanished in a locked room where Thiel was keeping her in a boarding house in Opelousas, the parish seat. The door was still locked from the outside, the window barred. Yet by morning she was gone, leaving behind only a torn piece of indigo cloth from her dress and a scent that witnesses described as resembling oleander, sweet but faintly poisonous. The entire parish erupted into chaos. Slave patrols searched the swamps and waterways. Rewards were posted. Riders spread the alarm. But this is where the story takes its first truly disturbing turn. 3 days later, the woman returned voluntarily, walking straight up the oak-lined driveway of the plantation owned by a man named Sebastian Duval, as calmly as if she had simply been out for a stroll. Duval was one of the wealthiest planters in Louisiana, the owner of over 200 enslaved people and 3,000 acres of prime sugarcane land. He was 43 years old, recently widowed, known for his cold and calculating business instincts, and he was one of the 5 men invited to bid on the woman. At T-Bolt's auction, she was meant to be sold to the highest bidder. When Duval questioned her about why she had come specifically to his plantation, the woman, whom he would later record in his ledgers under the name Celeste, gave an answer that should have chilled everyone who heard it. "I chose you." Those 3 simple words were something unimaginable in a system entirely built on belief that enslaved people had no choices at all. And yet Duval, instead of being disturbed, seemed almost flattered. Without hesitation, he paid T-Bolt double his asking price, $6,000, and claimed ownership of her that very same day. Within a week, Celeste had been placed not in the slave quarters, but in a small cottage on Duval's property, a building that had once housed his late wife's lady's maid. She was given fine clothing, her own servant, and, most astonishing of all, she was seen walking the gardens with Duval himself, sometimes for hours. The scandal spread through plantation society, like a stone dropped into still water. White women whispered behind their fans. Other planters watched with a mix of envy, fascination, and disapproval. Duval's own family wrote him letters expressing grave concerns about his judgment. Yet Duval appeared completely unmoved by public opinion, lost in what witnesses described as an almost trance-like infatuation. But what no one knew, what wouldn't be uncovered until much later, was that Celeste had studied Sebastian Duval long before she ever arrived in St. Landry Parish. She had learned his patterns, his weaknesses, his secret correspondence with other plantation owners. She knew about his financial troubles hidden behind his facade of wealth. She knew about his debts, his failing sugar crop, and most importantly, she knew about the 5 other men who competed with him for dominance in the parish. And she had a plan that would destroy every one of them. 3 months after Celeste's arrival, on a humid August night, when the air was so thick it seemed visible, Sebastian Duval hosted what would become the last dinner party of his life. The guest list was chosen with precision. Armand Lair, owner of a neighboring plantation, and Duval's chief rival in sugar production. Octave Rousseau, a cotton planter whose family had held land in the parish since 1780. Théoile Boudreau, the youngest of the group at 37, who had recently inherited his father's estate. And Philippe Saunier, the parish judge, a man whose influence extended into every corner of local law and society. These 5 men, including Duval himself, represented the absolute peak of power in that corner of Louisiana. Between them, They owned more than 1,000 enslaved people, controlled tens of thousands of acres, and held the economic lives of hundreds of families in their hands. The evening began much like any other gathering of elite planners. The men met in Duval's library, a room paneled in imported mahogany, drinking French cognac and smoking Cuban cigars while discussing crop prices and political developments in Washington. Dinner was served at 8 in the formal dining room. Turtle soup, roasted duck, oysters prepared 3 different ways, all accompanied by wines that cost more per bottle than most families earned in a month. But the atmosphere was tense. Every man at the table knew about Celeste, and every one of them wanted to see her. Duval had been deliberately vague in his letters about whether she would make an appearance, feeding their curiosity, their competitiveness, their hunger. It wasn't until dessert plates were being cleared that Duval finally acted. He rang a small silver bell, and the dining room door opened. Celeste stepped inside wearing a deep indigo dress, so dark it was nearly black in certain candlelit angles. Though modest by evening standards, covering her from neck to wrist to ankle, the dress drew attention to every movement she made. There was something about the way she carried herself, the quiet command in her posture, that contradicted everything these men believed about enslaved women. Her eyes, described by one witness as having a golden sheen in the flickering candlelight, moved slowly across the table, resting on each man with an expression both composed and strangely challenging. Philippe Saunier, the judge, would later write in a private letter to his brother in New Orleans, "I have seen beautiful women in Paris and New York, trained in every art of persuasion, but never have I encountered someone who seemed so completely aware of her own power, someone who controlled a room so completely, despite having no legal rights at all. It was profoundly unsettling." Duval introduced her simply as Celeste. Without explanation, the men struggled with how to react. Social custom dictated that they ignore an enslaved person's presence entirely, and yet doing so felt impossible. She spoke only once. When Duval asked her to recite a passage of French poetry, she delivered it flawlessly, her voice low, clear, and touched with an accent none of them could identify. But it was what happened afterward that haunted them all. She looked at each man directly, her gaze lingering just a second longer than comfort allowed. And then she smiled. Not a submissive smile, not a flirtatious smile. Something else, something that suggested she knew things about them they would do anything to keep buried. Then she left the room as silently as she had entered, leaving only the faint perfume of oleander behind her. The dinner party ended shortly after midnight. Each man left with forced composure. But within a week, something astonishing began to unfold. Letters arrived at the Duval plantation, one from each of the 4 guests. Every letter contained an offer to purchase Celeste, and the sums were extraordinary. Armand Lair offered $8,000. Octave Rousseau countered with $10,000. Théo Boudreau, impulsive and young, offered $12,000 plus a prize-breeding mare worth another $2,000. But it was Philippe Saunier's letter that revealed just how deeply obsession had taken root. The judge, known for his strict rationality, wrote, "Name your price. Whatever it is, I will pay it. I must have her. I will not know peace until she is mine." Duval's responses, preserved in Saunier's estate papers, show a man who had become erratic. He refused every offer, yet his refusals were taunting, almost cruel. He described in detail how intelligent Celeste was, how she could discuss literature and music, how she seemed to understand him in ways his late wife never had. And so the letters continued for 6 full weeks, a cycle of increasingly desperate offers and increasingly mocking refusals. The social fabric of the parish began to unravel. Long-standing friendships soured. Business partnerships fractured. All of it. Every argument, every sleepless night, because of one woman who rarely spoke, but somehow lived in every man's thoughts. Then on October 3rd, 1839, Sebastian Duval was found dead in his study. The circumstances were immediately suspicious. Duval had been discovered slumped over his desk, a half-finished letter in front of him, one hand still gripping a pen. His eyes were wide open, staring at something no one else could see. And in his other hand, clutched tightly, was a torn piece of indigo cloth, fabric from what looked like a woman's dress. The local doctor, summoned at once, found no visible cause of death, no wounds, no conventional signs of poison, no evidence of violence. Duval's heart, he concluded, had simply stopped, perhaps from some sudden apoplexy or seizure. But several details made that explanation difficult to believe. The letter Duval had been writing was addressed to Armand Lair, and its content was alarming. You must not pursue this further. She is not what you think. I have made a terrible mistake in bringing her here. If you value your life and your soul, you'll forget you ever saw. The sentence ended there, the ink trailing off exactly where his hand had stopped moving. Even more troubling were the accounts from household servants. On the night before his death, several servants claimed they heard Duval arguing with someone in his study. His voice rose sharply, in tones that sounded like fear or anger. Yet, when they listened closely at the door, they heard only him. One voice, no other, and Celeste had vanished again. Her cottage stood empty, the bed neatly made, her few belongings gone. The only things left behind were the faint scent of oleander and another piece of indigo cloth. This one folded carefully on the pillow. The parish authorities, led by Judge Philippe Sonner, launched an investigation. Slave patrols were sent in all directions. Rewards were posted. And for a brief moment it seemed like a serious search was underway. But Sonner made a critical decision, one that would later prove fatal. He ordered the search conducted quietly, without any public announcement. Officially, he claimed it was to prevent scandal. In truth, he didn't want anyone but himself to find her. Very quickly, the investigation into Duval's death became something entirely different. A competition among four powerful men, each determined to be the first to locate Celeste. Armand Lair, whose plantation bordered Duval's, organized private search parties made up of his most trusted overseers. He offered substantial rewards for information, money he secretly raised by selling off parcels of his land, a fact unknown until his estate was probated years later. Octave Rousseau took another route. He hired a slave tracker from Mississippi named Caleb Frost, a man famous for finding runaways no matter how far they fled or how well they'd hidden. Rousseau paid Frost $500 up front and promised an additional $1,000 if he returned Celeste alive and unharmed. Théo Boudreau, the youngest of the group, fell into near mania. He spent entire days riding through swamps and back roads, questioning every free person of color, every shopkeeper, every river pilot he encountered. His obsession grew so intense that his family staged an intervention, begging him to stop a pursuit and return to plantation he'd been neglecting. But the most reckless search was led by Judge Philippe Sonner. As the investigating authority, he had access to court records, property deeds, and correspondence between plantations, resources unavailable to the others. He began scrutinizing every transaction involving enslaved women in the parish over the previous 5 years, looking for the faintest mention of Celeste or anyone resembling her. What he found should have warned him to stop. He learned that Celeste had been sold 4 times before arriving in Louisiana, and at each of her previous locations, something disturbing had happened. In Charleston, the man who had owned her died suddenly of what was described as brain fever. In Savannah before that, 2 brothers who had competed to purchase her ended up killing each other in a duel, though no one could recall what they'd been fighting about. In Virginia, a planter who acquired her lost everything in a catastrophic business failure and hanged himself in his tobacco barn. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to face the truth. But Sonner's obsession blinded him. Instead of recognizing danger, he convinced himself that he was different from the others, that he alone could possess her without sharing their fate. While these 4 men hunted for her, autumn faded into winter and the Louisiana weather grew erratic, swinging from warm, suffocating humidity to sudden cold snaps that killed the last of the blooming flowers. Something strange settled over St. Landry Parish. Neighbors who'd been close for decades stopped speaking. Wives complained their husbands seemed distracted, distant, almost haunted. Business deals that seemed certain suddenly collapsed. A heavy pall hung over the region like a fog no wind could lift. And then, in early December, Celeste returned. She was seen walking along the river road, the main route connecting the plantations, moving with the same calm, unhurried grace she always had. She didn't hide. She didn't run. When a patrol spotted her, she simply stopped and waited. Uncertain how to handle someone so valuable, the patrol leader brought her directly to Judge Saunders' plantation. After all, Saunders was leading the official investigation into Duval's death and her disappearance. Saunders placed her in one of the unused overseer's houses on the property, a small but comfortable structure with. The overseer's house where Saunders placed her had its own fireplace and simple furnishings. He ordered guards to stand outside the door, but he gave strict instructions. She was not to be mistreated under any circumstances. That evening, he visited her himself, carrying food, wine, candles, and several books. What passed between them that night remains unknown. No one was close enough to hear their conversation, but several witnesses later said they saw candlelight flickering in the windows until nearly dawn. And they heard something else as well, something that unsettled them deeply. Laughter. Not Saunders' deep baritone, but a woman's laugh, soft, knowing, drifting to the cold December air. The next morning, Saunders sent letters to Lair, Rousseau, and Boudreau. The letters were identical, brief, final, and cruel in their simplicity. The matter we have all been concerned with has been resolved. The property in question is now in my possession and will remain so. I strongly advise you to abandon any further interest in this affair. The responses revealed men standing at the edge of reason. Lair's reply was barely coherent, a tangled mix of rage and desperation. Rousseau's was cold and threatening, hinting at legal action. Boudreau's was the most disturbing, a rambling 10-page confession alternating between declarations of love for a woman he had seen for less than an hour and vivid descriptions of dreams in which she called him from dark water. Saunders ignored them all. For the next 3 weeks, he spent every evening in that overseer's cottage, sometimes staying until dawn. His wife, a woman from a prominent New Orleans family, packed her belongings, gathered their 3 children, and returned to her father's home. Saunders seemed neither to notice nor to care. Those who saw him during this time reported dramatic changes. He lost weight. Dark half-moons appeared beneath his eyes. His usually impeccable clothing became rumpled and poorly kept. But more alarming than his appearance was his behavior. He began issuing erratic legal rulings, deciding in favor of plaintiffs he had previously opposed, dismissing cases that clearly needed to go to trial. His fellow judges quietly discussed whether he was still mentally fit to serve. Then, on the morning of December 27, 1839, just before dawn, a slave from Saunders' plantation sprinted to main house, shouting that something terrible had happened at the overseer's cottage. They found Judge Philippe Saunders lying in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, exactly as Duval had been found. There were no signs of violence, no visible injuries, but in his hand he clutched a piece of indigo cloth, and the expression on his face. Those who saw it later said it was pure terror, as though he had witnessed something in his final moments that had frozen his heart mid-beat. Celeste was gone. The guards swore no one had entered or exited the cottage all night, yet she had vanished like smoke on a strong wind, leaving behind only the unmistakable scent of oleander and another neatly folded piece of indigo cloth on the pillow. 2 men dead in 3 months, both found under identical circumstances, and 3 men still consumed by their obsession to find a woman who connected them all. The parish was about to learn that some hunts are not driven by the hunters, but orchestrated by the prey. The death of Judge Saunders should have ended the madness. It should have warned Armand Lair, Octave Rousseau, and Théophile Boudreau that pursuing Celeste led only to ruin. But obsession follows its own logic, untouched by reason or fear. In fact, Saunders' death only intensified their pursuit. With two rivals gone, the remaining three felt the prize was closer, more attainable. None of them understood that they were not hunting her at all. She was positioning them, one by one, exactly where she wanted them. In the weeks following Saunders' death, the official investigation turned surreal. The new judge assigned to the case, a man from Baton Rouge unfamiliar with local politics, quickly became frustrated. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Servants from both the Duval and Saunders plantations gave testimonies, so vague they were almost meaningless. The physician who had examined both bodies performed a second, more detailed autopsy on Saunders. He discovered small traces of plant residue under the judge's fingernails and inside his mouth, as though he had been chewing leaves. The plant was eventually identified as oleander, a toxic shrub where every part is poisonous. Even touching it can irritate the skin. Eating it can cause cardiac arrest. But the physician could not determine whether Saunders had ingested enough to kill him. And more importantly, why would an educated judge knowingly consume a lethal plant? The official cause of death was listed as heart failure of unknown origin, and the investigation was quietly closed. Meanwhile, across St. Landry Parish, rumors about Celeste grew wilder. Some claimed she was the daughter of a Haitian priestess trained in dark, forbidden arts. Others said she had been educated in France by courtesans who taught her how to manipulate powerful men. Still others whispered she had made a pact with something unholy, trading her soul for revenge against enslavers. None of the stories were true, but they had a purpose. They obscured the real truth, a truth both simpler and far more terrifying. Celeste was just a woman who had mastered the only weapons available to her in a world built to strip her of all power. She understood that men like Duval, Saunders, Lair, Rousseau, and Boudreau viewed enslaved women as objects, a desire to be owned, and she turned that desire into a trap. In late January of 1840, Caleb Frost, the slave tracker hired by Octave Rousseau, sent word that he had found a promising lead. A free woman of color living in New Orleans claimed she had seen someone matching Celeste's description staying in a boarding house in the Treem neighborhood. Rousseau left the city immediately, carrying $5,000 in cash and legal documents granting him power of attorney to purchase any property he deemed necessary. He was gone for 2 weeks, and when he returned to his plantation, he brought Celeste with him, or rather, a woman he believed to be Celeste. She matched the physical description: the height, the copper-toned skin, the unusual eyes. But those who had truly seen Celeste sensed immediately that something was different. This woman was quieter, more subdued, lacking that eerie, deliberate stillness that had defined the original. Rousseau did not notice, or he refused to. He had her placed in the finest guest room of his plantation house, abandoning even the pretense of keeping her in the slave quarters. He bought her expensive clothing, jewelry, perfumes, and when his longtime housekeeper dared to object, he dismissed her on the spot. He spent hours each day with the woman, emerging only for meals or to shout angrily at his overseers when they interrupted him with plantation business. When Armand Lair and Théophile Boudreau heard Rousseau had found Celeste, they rode straight to the plantation and demanded to see her. Rousseau met them on his porch, rifle in hand, and refused to let them enter. "She chose me," he screamed. The same words Duval had once used, the same words Saunders had repeated. "Just as she chose Duval, just as she chose Saunders. And I will not die like they did, because I understand what they never did. She is not to be treated as property, but as a partner and equal." The irony of a man who owned over 300 human beings speaking about equality was completely lost on Rousseau in his delusion. But Lair and Boudreau heard something else in his rant, something chilling. For the first time, they wondered if the deaths of Duval and Saunders weren't random tragedies at all, but part of a terrifying pattern. They began investigating seriously, not to possess Celeste, but to understand her. They hired investigators from New Orleans to trace her past. They spoke to slave traders who had handled her sales. They reviewed every bill of sale, every shipping manifest. And slowly, A picture began to form, one far more disturbing than any supernatural tale. Celeste had been born into slavery in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, around 1813. She had been brought to America as a child during the chaos that followed the Haitian Revolution. Her mother, a house servant, had secretly learned to read and write and passed those skills to her daughter. Celeste had been sold multiple times as she grew older, each sale prompted by the suspicious death or ruin of her owner. But then came the key discovery, found by Lair in a shipping manifest from 1825. Celeste had lived for 2 years on a plantation in Virginia owned by a botanist who specialized in cultivating medicinal and poisonous plants. This botanist had used enslaved workers to tend his experimental gardens filled with every toxic plant that could grow in the South. Foxglove, hemlock, nightshade, castor beans, and yes, oleander. The manifest noted the botanist died in 1827 from accidental poisoning. His widow, horrified by what she suspected the enslaved workers had learned, wrote in her diary that she could not abide keeping servants who knew so much about death. She sold them all, Celeste included. Armed with this information, Armand Lair made a decision that could be described as courage or utter foolishness. He rode to Rousseau's plantation, demanded entry, and when Rousseau refused, Lair shouted across the front lawn loud enough for everyone to hear. "The woman in your house is not who you think she is. She is a killer who's been murdering slave owners for over 10 years. You will die just like Duval and Saunter if you don't listen to me." Rousseau's only response was to fire his rifle over Lair's head and order his overseers to chase him off the property. That night, Rousseau sat down to dinner with the woman he believed was Celeste. She had insisted on preparing the meal herself, a gesture he found romantic. They dined by candlelight: roasted chicken, herb potatoes, a salad of fresh greens, warm bread from the oven. The next morning, Octave Rousseau was found dead in his bed, his eyes wide open, a piece of indigo cloth clutched in his hand. 3 men dead, 2 still alive. And somewhere in Louisiana, the real Celeste was preparing her next move. The death of Octave Rousseau finally shattered the wall of denial that had allowed the earlier deaths to be swept aside. The new judge assigned to the case, Haitian Revolution of Natchitoches, a strict and no-nonsense magistrate, refused to accept heart failure of unknown origin as a sufficient explanation for a third death in such an obvious pattern. Judge Marin ordered that Rousseau's body be examined by a physician from New Orleans. Dr. Henri Laval, a Paris-trained doctor with experience in the new field of forensic medicine. Dr. Laval's findings revealed what the local doctors had missed or perhaps intentionally ignored. Rousseau had died from cardiac arrest caused by cardiac glycosides, poisons found in plants such as foxglove and oleander. More specifically, Dr. Laval discovered traces of oleander in Rousseau's stomach and on the dinner plates from his final meal. The salad greens, he concluded, had been mixed with young oleander leaves, which closely resemble other bitter greens in both appearance and taste. Someone unfamiliar with plants might never notice until it was too late. The woman who had been staying with Rousseau, the one he believed was Celeste, had disappeared. But this time, there was a witness. A young house servant named Marie had seen the mysterious woman leaving the plantation just before dawn. Marie's testimony was clear and precise. The woman carried a small traveling bag and walked toward the river road. But the detail that stunned investigators was this. She didn't look like the woman Master Rousseau brought from New Orleans. Marie said her face was different. Her walk was different. I think maybe she wore some kind of disguise when he found her, and now she was back to her real self. This meant something horrifying. Celeste was so skilled at manipulation that she could alter her. She had altered her appearance enough to fool a man who'd been given her exact description and had even paid a professional tracker to find her. She had intentionally allowed herself to be found, intentionally allowed herself to be brought to Rousseau's plantation, all while playing a role until the perfect moment to strike. Judge Marin issued an arrest warrant for Celeste, charging her with 3 counts of murder. He sent her description to every parish in Louisiana and to neighboring states, offering a $5,000 reward for information leading to her capture. He warned authorities that she was extremely dangerous and should be approached with caution. But Marin also did something far wiser. He ordered immediate protective custody for Armand Lair and Théophile Boudreau, the two surviving men from the original dinner party. Lair accepted the protection without hesitation. He had been terrified since Rousseau's death. He jumped at shadows, refused to eat any food he hadn't personally watched being prepared, and slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He moved into a hotel in Opelousas under guard, bringing only a few trusted servants and a single trunk of clothing. Théophile Boudreau, however, refused. Nearly 20 months after that cursed dinner party, Boudreau had transformed into someone almost unrecognizable. He had lost perhaps 40 pounds from his already lean frame. Gray streaks had appeared at his temples long before their time. His hands trembled constantly, and he spoke aloud to people no one else could see, carrying on hushed conversations with invisible companions. When Judge Marin arrived at the plantation to insist on protective custody, Boudreau met him on the porch, disheveled, pale, and wide-eyed. What he said would be remembered by everyone who heard it. "You don't understand. None of you understand. She's not coming to kill me. She's coming to free me. I've been waiting for her. I've been preparing for her. And when she arrives, I'm going to finally tell her the truth." "What truth?" Marin demanded. "What are you talking about?" But Boudreau only smiled, a broken, desperate smile, and replied, "Ask her yourself when you find her. Ask her about the Boudreau plantation in Saint-Domingue. Ask her about the fire in 1804. Ask her about the woman and child who died in that fire. Ask her why she's doing this." Then he walked inside and locked the door, refusing to speak further. Judge Marin, deeply unsettled by this cryptic warning, returned to his office and began digging into historical records. What he found revealed the first real insight into Celeste's motive, the first glimpse of the engine driving her decades-long plan for revenge. In 1804, during the chaos of the Haitian Revolution, a French plantation owner named Gaspard Boudreau attempted to abandon his estate and flee to Louisiana. According to ship manifests, he loaded a vessel with as much wealth as he could carry and a dozen enslaved people he deemed most valuable. Before the ship could depart, revolutionaries attacked the plantation. A fire erupted. The house burned to the ground. Most of the Boudreau family died in the flames, but Gaspard escaped with his youngest son, a 4-year-old boy who would later become Théophile Boudreau's father. The ship's manifest listed the enslaved individuals who made it aboard. Among them was a woman identified only as Marguerite and a child, age 5, both property of the Boudreau estate. There were no further records of Marguerite in Louisiana. She was never listed among the enslaved people register when Gaspard established his new plantation in St. Landry Parish. The child was missing from the records as well. Judge Marin tracked down Théophile's elderly aunt, one of the last surviving relatives from that generation. She remembered the voyage from Haiti. She remembered Gaspard's violent temper throughout the journey. She remembered the woman and child, but they were not on the ship when it arrived. What happened to them? Marin asked. The old woman's answer was delivered flatly, without emotion. The woman tried to escape during the fire. She was branded afterward. The wound became infected on the voyage. Gaspard said she was going to die anyway and would be a burden. He said the child would be troubled too, probably run like her mother. So he had them both thrown overboard, somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. He told everyone they died of fever. The servants knew the truth. But who would believe slaves over a white man? Marin now understood. If Celeste was about 26 years old in 1839, she would have been born around 1813. But what if that was a lie? What if she was older than she appeared? What if she was that 5-year-old child from the manifest? If so, she had survived. Somehow, perhaps she'd been tossed overboard close enough to shore to swim or cling to debris. Perhaps another vessel found her. However it happened, she lived and she had spent more than 30 years plotting her revenge against the men who murdered her mother and tried to murder her. Gaspar Boudreaux had died in 1831, but his son inherited his plantation, his wealth, and possibly the guilt of family's crimes. And the four other men at that dinner party, Duval, Saunier, Lair, and Rousseau, had all been close friends and business partners of Gaspar Boudreaux. They all profited from the Haitian plantation system. They all knew what happened to that woman and child, or they knew enough to remain complicit through silence. Celeste wasn't killing random plantation owners. She was eliminating very specific men for very specific reasons, using their own desires, egos, and prejudices as weapons against them. Now, armed with the truth, Judge Marin doubled the guards protecting Armand Lair and intensified the search for Celeste. He also sent deputies to Théophile Boudreaux's plantation with orders to bring him into custody by force if needed. But when deputies arrived at the Boudreaux plantation on the evening of February 14, 1840, they found the front door standing open and a trail of indigo cloth leading from the entrance to the house into the study. There they found Théophile Boudreaux sitting at his father's old desk, a pen still in his hand and a completed letter before him. He was dead, eyes open, the same frozen expression of terror carved into his face. And in his other hand, clutched tightly, of indigo cloth, the letter he had written was addressed to Celeste. When the deputies read it, they immediately understood it could never be shown to the public, because it confirmed everything Judge Marin had suspected. And even more, you were 5 years old. The letter began, I was 6. I watched from the ship's railing as my father ordered you and your mother thrown into the sea. I watched as you surfaced, crying for help. I watched as your mother tried to swim while holding you above the water. I watched as my father laughed and said the sharks would finish what he started. I have carried this image for 34 years. Not a day has passed when I haven't seen your face, haven't heard your mother's screams. I grew up knowing I was complicit in murder. I grew up knowing that one day, somehow, there would be a reckoning. When I saw you at Duval's dinner party, I knew immediately who you were. Your eyes were the same eyes that looked up at me from those dark waters. I knew then that you had come back for all of us. I knew I deserved whatever fate you planned. I welcome it. If you read this before you find me, know that I do not resist. I am sorry. I was a child, but I was old enough to know what I witnessed was wrong, and I never spoke against it. I deserve this death and worse. The letter was signed and dated February 14th, 1840. Next to on the desk stood a cup of tea, still warm, its surface scattered with leaves that would later be identified as oleander. Théophile Boudreaux had taken his own life, but only after Celeste had visited him. Servants confirmed that a woman matching her description had arrived that afternoon, had been admitted to the study at Boudreaux's insistence, and had left about an hour later. She had brought a small basket, which she left behind. Inside were fresh oleander cuttings and a small book of French poetry. For men dead, one remained, and Armand Lair, sitting in his guard hotel room, was about to learn that all the protection in the world could not save him from a woman who had spent decades honing patience into a weapon. Armand Lair spent 43 days under protective custody. 43 days of mounting paranoia and unraveling sanity that reduced a once proud plantation owner to a hollowed-out fragment of himself. His hotel room became a prison. He refused to eat anything he did not watch being prepared from raw ingredients. He slept in short bursts, waking with a jolt at every creak or gust of wind. He demanded that the guards outside his door be rotated every 4 hours, convinced Celeste a bribe, or seduce them if given time. He started drinking heavily, 2 bottles of brandy per day. Judge Marin visited him often, trying to keep Lair cooperative with the investigation. But each visit revealed a man sinking further into delusion. Lair spun elaborate theories. Celeste had climbed through the chimney. She could slip through hidden passages he was certain existed in the walls. She could poison the air itself. She's not human, Lair insisted during one visit. No human being could do what she's done. She's something else, Something we brought with us from Saint-Domingue. Something that should have stayed buried on that cursed island. Marin tried to explain that Celeste was entirely human, simply patient, intelligent, and skilled with poisons. But Lair was beyond reason. The manhunt for Celeste spread across the entire South. Her description was circulated to every parish in Louisiana, every county in Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. Slave patrols were alerted, river pilots questioned, hotels and boarding houses searched. Rewards amounting to $10,000 were offered for information leading to her capture, but she remained invisible, as if she had melted into the landscape, one woman among thousands of enslaved women, unnoticed by those who refused to see them as individuals. Then, on March 28, 1840, Armand Lair received a letter. It came with the regular mail, tucked among business correspondence and newspapers. The envelope was fine paper, sealed with indigo wax. Inside was a single sheet written in elegant handwriting. Mr. Lair, you were there the night my mother died. You were on the boat. You were 14 years old enough to know right from wrong, and you did nothing. You stood beside Gaspar Boudreau and his son, and watched as a woman and child were murdered for the crime of wanting freedom. In the 35 years since that night, you have built a fortune on the backs of people you consider property. You have separated families, sold children from their mothers, worked human beings to death in your cane fields. You believe yourself a good master because you provide food and shelter. You believe yourself a Christian because you allow your slaves to attend church. You have never once questioned the evil of owning another human being. I am not a demon. I am not a supernatural force. I am simply the consequence of your choices, delayed but never forgotten. I am what happens when you build prosperity on suffering and assume there will never be a reckoning. By the time you read this letter, I am already in the hotel. I have been here for 3 days, watching you, waiting for the right moment. Your guards do not see me because they are not looking for me. They are looking for a beautiful slave woman, exotic and noticeable. They are not looking for the chambermaid who changes your sheets, who is past 30, ordinary, and invisible to men like you. Tonight, you will drink your evening brandy. Tomorrow morning, they will find you as they found the others. And I will move on to the next name on my list, because there were more than 5 men who profited from my mother's murder. There are dozens, and I have all the time in the world. This is not a threat you can negotiate with, nor a danger you can buy your way out of. This is justice, delayed but inevitable. You wish to possess me. Instead, you will join the others who tried. The letter was not signed. Lair immediately summoned Judge Marin and showed it to him. Marin ordered the entire hotel searched at once. Every guest was questioned, every employee interrogated, every room inspected. They found nothing, no trace of her, no evidence she had ever been there. Yet the letter made one thing painfully clear. Matching Celeste's description was in the hotel. The chambermaids were all accounted for. 2 older women well known to the hotel manager, and a younger woman who had been working there for 3 months, a woman named Louise, nearly 40, heavy-set, her skin marked by pox scars. Marin questioned Louise extensively. Her papers identified her as a free woman of color from Mobile, Alabama. She had references from previous employers. Her landlord confirmed she rented a room in town. Everything checked out perfectly. But there was something in her eyes, something that made Marin uneasy, a patient amusement, as though she were watching him struggle with a puzzle whose answer was obvious. Have you seen anyone suspicious in the hotel? Marin asked. No, sir, she replied in an accent that sounded genuinely local. Just the usual guests and the gentleman in room 7 who doesn't sleep much. Monsieur Lair. You've seen him? Marin pressed. Yes, sir. I hear him pacing at night when I come in to tend the fires. Poor man seems very troubled. You tend the fire in his room? Yes, sir. Every evening around 6, and again at 10 if he requests it. Marin felt his stomach sink. You've been in his room alone? Well, sir, One of the guards is always right outside the door, she said calmly. They watch me go in and out. I'm only there a few minutes to add wood to the fire and make sure the lamps have enough oil. Marin turned to the guards. How long has this woman been tending the room? Since he arrived, sir. Same as in all the other rooms. And you watch her the entire time? Of course, sir. She's never done anything suspicious. She just tend to fire and leaves. Marin looked back at Louise, truly looked at her, past the pox scars, past the weight, past the age. And beneath the disguise, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A flash of those unusual golden eyes described in every report about Celeste. Arrest this woman, he said quietly. Louise did not run. She didn't even flinch. She simply stood there, that patient smile still on her lips, and said, For what crime, sir? I'm a free woman doing honest work. You're Celeste, Marin said. You wrote that letter. My name is Louise Benoit, sir. I have papers proving it. Your eyes, they're the same as in the reports. Many people have light-colored eyes, sir. That's hardly proof of anything. Marin had her taken into custody anyway, but he knew he had a problem. If this was Celeste, she had created an entirely believable new identity. Documents, references, witnesses, history. Without a confession or hard evidence, he had no legal grounds to hold her for murder. He ordered a full search. They found nothing. No poisons, no indigo cloth, no evidence linking her to any death. He had the brandy in Laird's room examined, clean. The firewood, clean. The lamps, bedding, furniture, nothing. Frustrated, Marin had Louise locked in a courthouse room while he decided what to do. Meanwhile, Armand Laird, believing his would-be killer, was finally behind bars, relaxed for the first time in weeks. That night, he ate a full meal. He drank a single glass of brandy to help him sleep. Exhausted, he lay down and closed his eyes. The next morning, the guards found him dead, eyes wide open, a piece of indigo cloth clutched in his hand. At the courthouse, Louise Benoit sat in her locked room, that same patient smile on her face. When Judge Marin questioned her about Laird's death, she had an airtight alibi. She had been in custody the entire time. How? Marin demanded. How did you kill him? I didn't kill anyone, sir. I was here, as you well know. Then who did? Louise leaned back, calm, the disguise still flawless. Judge Marin, you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't who killed Armand Laird. The question is, when did the poison enter his body? Marin stared at her as the truth began to form. I tended his fire every evening for 43 days, Louise said softly. Every evening I brought wood for fire. Beautiful wood, carefully selected. Oleander branches, dried and cured so they wouldn't be immediately recognized. She continued. Every evening for 43 days, he breathed in smoke from burning oleander. Small amounts, not enough to kill at once, but enough to build up in his body day by day, week by week. By the time you arrested me, the poison was already inside him, just waiting for the accumulated dose to reach the tipping point. You're confessing to murder, Marin said. I'm explaining a hypothetical, sir. How someone might kill a man while having a perfect alibi. But of course, you'll never prove any of this. The firewood is long burned. The smoke is gone. And I'm just a chambermaid doing my job. Marin had her held for trial, but he knew she was right. He had no physical evidence, no witnesses, only suspicion. Her trial lasted 3 days and ended in an acquittal. The jury, white men who could not imagine a woman, especially an enslaved or formerly enslaved woman, capable of such sophisticated plan, found reasonable doubt in every charge. Louise Benoit walked out of the courthouse a free woman and vanished into the crowds of New Orleans. She was never seen again. But the story did not end there. In the months after Laird's death and Louise's acquittal, Judge Haitian Marin became obsessed with tracing Celeste's entire history. He traveled to Charleston, Savannah, and Richmond, searching records and interviewing anyone who had encountered her. What he uncovered was a revenge campaign spanning more than 30 years and claiming at least 17 victims, possibly more. Every man who had been on that ship the night Celeste and her mother were thrown overboard. Every man who had been a business associate of Gaspar Boudreaux. Every man who had profited from the Saint-Domingue plantation system. All had died under mysterious circumstances over the past 15 years. Some had died suddenly, like the 5 men in St. Landry Parish. Others had been ruined financially first, forced to watch everything they built crumble before death finally claimed them. The methods varied, but the signature was always the same: a piece of indigo cloth and the faint scent of oleander. Marin compiled all his findings into a detailed report, but he never submitted it. Instead, he kept it as a private document. Years later, on his deathbed, he told his grandson, "I pursued her because it was my duty, but I'm glad I never caught her." What she did was murder, yes, but it was also the only justice available to someone denied every legal path to retribution. The law says slavery is legal. The law says a black woman's testimony means nothing against a white man's word. The law says she has no standing to seek justice for her mother's murder. So she created justice herself, and she carried it out with more patience and precision than any court ever could. The story of Celeste, whatever her real name was, became a whispered legend in Louisiana. But it was a legend that made white plantation owners deeply uncomfortable. So they smothered it. They suppressed it. They erased it from official histories. The deaths were attributed to coincidence, to illness, to anything except a deliberate, decades-long campaign of revenge. But in the slave quarters of plantations across the South, a different story was told. A story of a woman who survived the impossible. A woman who learned to use intelligence as a weapon, who turned the master's own desires against him. She became a symbol of resistance, proof that the powerless were not truly powerless if they were patient enough, clever enough, and determined enough. For decades after the trial, there were reports of Celeste sightings. A woman matching her description teaching black children in Philadelphia in the 1850s. Another helping escaped slaves cross into Canada in the 1860s. Another seen in Paris in the 1870s, living quietly as an artist. Whether any of these sightings were real is impossible to know. What is documented is this. After 1840, no more pieces of indigo cloth were found in the hands of dead plantation owners. Either Celeste had completed her revenge, or she had moved on to another kind of life entirely. The 5 men from that dinner party in August 1839 were all dead within 7 months. Their estates were divided among heirs who fought bitterly over assets and eventually sold off most of the land. The plantations they had once ruled with such pride were broken up, auctioned, repurposed. None of their family lines continued in St. Landry Parish. It was as if they had been erased from history, which might be exactly what Celeste intended. In 1847, Louisiana authorities ordered all documents related to the case sealed and later destroyed. The official explanation claimed the material was too scandalous, that it might inspire enslaved people to commit violence. But the truth, the whispered truth, was far simpler. The case proved something the white power structure could never openly admit, that they were not invincible, that the people they oppressed were not helpless, and that revenge could be patient enough to stretch across decades. The last known document about Celeste was a letter found among Judge Marin's papers after his death. It was addressed to him, postmarked from Boston, dated 1865, the same year the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. It read, "Judge Marin, you came closer to stopping me than anyone else. You understood what I was doing and why. I have followed your career and seen that you became a voice for reform, for treating enslaved people as human beings with rights. Perhaps our encounter changed you. Perhaps seeing what revenge looks like when all legal avenues are closed taught you that the law must serve justice for everyone, not only the powerful. The war is over now. Slavery is ending. My work is complete. The men who murdered my mother are dead. The system that enabled them is collapsing. I can finally rest. I was never a demon, never supernatural. I was simply a woman who refused to forget. For 35 years, I remember my mother's face as she drowned. Every day, I planned how to make the men responsible pay. Patience and knowledge were my only weapons, and I used them well. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not expect understanding. But I hope you realize that what I did was the only justice my mother would ever receive. The indigo cloth was from her dress, the dress she wore when they threw her into the sea. I kept a piece of it all these years. Every time I left a piece with a body, I was saying, her death will not be forgotten. Her murder will not go unpunished. Remember that when you judge me. The letter was not signed, but Mara knew exactly who had written it. He kept it locked in his desk for the rest of his life. Late at night, he would take it out, read it, and wonder whether justice and revenge were really so different after all. Because the story of Celeste, the most desired enslaved woman in Louisiana, is not a ghost story. It is a story about the terrible patience of the oppressed, the long memory of the wronged, and the inevitable reckoning that follows when human beings are treated as property. It is a reminder that every system of injustice creates its own destroyers, and that some debts demand generations to settle. In the end, 5 men paid with their lives for a crime committed in the Gulf of Mexico in 1804. And somewhere, a woman who survived the impossible finally found peace, knowing her mother's death had not been forgotten. What do you think of this story? Do you believe justice and revenge are the same? Do you think Celeste was right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the hidden histories of resistance and injustice, share it with someone who appreciates dark truths buried in our past. Subscribe to the channel for more forgotten stories that challenge the way we think about history. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into the shadows of the American past. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.